And good morning from me and a very warm welcome to what is going to be a fascinating insight into one of the most significant historical areas of Queenscliff, Fisherman's Flats. We will be presented with the result of dedicated in-depth research over many months by the Queenscliff Historical Museum volunteers of the Fisherman's Flats. This research has been led by resident Richard Bell, assisted by Maggie Stowers, Roger Higgins, Danuta Karski and Sue White, and ably guided by our Head of Research, Diana Sawyer. The research opens the window into early Victorian life, particularly in Queenscliff, and of the times. You will find bravery, tragedy, scandal, community spirit and great service provided by those who lived on Fisherman's Flats. Today, Richard Bell will focus on the story of the Todd family, Larrikins, lunatics, lifeboats, lords and ladies. The Netflix series coming up. Please welcome Richard Bell. Thank you.
Good morning. For those of you who are from Point Lonsdale, this is an unfamiliar scene. This is a bar. They are rooms that are found in hotels. It's a place where you can go and get a drink. There were 7 hotels in Queenscliff in the period that we'll be talking about. There are none for those unfortunates who live in this part of the borough. That's our staff. I want to acknowledge the input and support of the last of the fishermen. I was fortunate enough to live in the flats on Beach Street when there were still 5 of the original fishermen around. We no longer have any of them. They and their families were incredibly generous in sharing their knowledge, in sharing artefacts, images, photographs and stories about their families and about the past. Any families who wish to contribute to this work, we'd be very grateful. We always begin our research day by looking back. So what happened on the 28th of June, on this day, in the past that's relevant to us here? 186 years ago, Victoria was crowned. She'd already been Queen for about a year. So she's the Queen in Queenscliff, and of course Victoria, both the colony and the state are named after her. One of our most famous rogues, Ned Kelly, was shot and captured at Glenrowan 144 years ago. Importantly, 110 years ago, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, he was the heir apparent to become the Emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, were shot and killed. 1 month later, the world was at war. At least 5 young men from the flats died in that war, killed in action. Now we're back in 1843. This is a map from that time of Paywit. Swan Island was grazing land for lease, and the only things that appear in Queenscliff were a village reserve, a lighthouse, and a pilot station. 100 years on, this is Queenscliff. And what I want you to look at is very clearly there's a demarcation here. To the right of the screen is Queenscliff, the township where the great and the good lived. To the left of the screen is an enclave. This is where the fishermen lived. There was a degree of separation. Harry Muchmore, who I knew, I could never take the dog for a walk because Harry would be in his front yard and we'd chat for hours, stated without any rancour, they always looked down on us. That was how the rest of the town looked at the fishermen. Out of that sentiment, Fisherman's Flat A separate enclave from the rest of the town on low-lying ground was defined by a single profession, which makes it quite unique. Our research has identified 150 distinct surnames of people resident in the flats. Some of these relate to large families, large fishing dynasties, others to a single individual. The Todd family story provides a lens on the life of these folk. We have about 30 family stories that we've fully documented. It also provides a lens on colonial life and early post-Federation life. Queenscliff was proclaimed as a municipality on the 4th of May 1863. And here's an extract from the Government Gazette, signed by Sir Henry Berkeley, Order of the Bath and so on. Important guy. My father would look at that photo and says, he needs a haircut. Sorry. Berkeley was, however, no stranger to Queenscliff. There's no wonder it got through quite quickly. He'd spent holidays here. His daughter nearly drowned the year before while bathing in February 1862. She was rescued by her mother's maid, but her governess drowned. Mary Jones could not be saved, and she's in the Queenscliff Cemetery now. The origins of the Fisherman's Reserve. You can see the sentiment expressed in the panel on the right. This is the Queenscliff Borough Council. The Mayor was Dr. D.J. Williams. The first subject on the agenda, 18th of the 1st, 1864, the indiscriminate manner in which the fishermen, who are getting very numerous, were allowed to squat on or occupy the land, so the flat will soon be strewed with their huts without any regularity. This particularly offended those who were involved in tourism, the people that ran the grand hotels. 130 fishermen working in Queenscliff. They were camped higgledy-piggledy to the north of Simon Street, near Swan Bay, on Swan Island, and even a few on Mud Island, a horrible place to live. The complaints about the fishermen squatting resulted in a government survey to create allotments. Those allotments were created, but within 15 years, 25% of them were taken away again. They were leasehold, and the leases could be revoked at 3 months' notice. And that actually happened. The railways needed space, and they took it. There was a bitter public debate, which really divided the town. Petitions to government, a plebiscite of ratepayers, and eventually low-lying land was filled and further allotments were created to the north of Wharf Street. Francis Longmore, Minister for Lands, got caught up in this. His department proposed replacement allotments in the park, close to the pier, which would be ideal for the fishermen. The decision was not favoured by the borough and by many of the citizens. A resolution, letters, petitions, deputations to government resulted. And here, nicely anonymous, a councillor of the Borough of Queenscliff, and here's what he says: I've indicated and view with disfavour any attempt to disfigure the growing beauties of the reserve. And here's something that's actually in the council minutes. This council protests in the strongest manner possible against the cutting up of the reserve, and more especially to the scheme for the removal of fishermen's houses, therefore, believing it would mar and damage the appearance of that portion of the borough and destroy the privacy of the public baths. It became a political hot potato. Here's the local member, Mr. Ince, member of the Legislative Assembly. He took a group, a deputation, to the Acting Chief Secretary. Some of the things that were said include, it It was claimed the land in question was a recreation reserve and that if it were occupied by the fishermen, their dirty habits would probably lead to disease as well as annoyance. These were very strong words and really quite nasty. The acting governor of the day, Brian O'Loughlin, agreed with the sentiments that were presented. Here's a dirty fisherman and his family. The man in the centre is Daniel Muchmore Jr. His wife is beside him, and the 6 daughters he had before he was able to have a son surround him. His family and many of the other fishermen and their wives struck back, and there was a maelstrom of correspondence in the Argus which was carrying these arguments forward. In the end, the government demanded that the borough have a plebiscite. The plebiscite was held in October of 1879. 200 people were eligible to vote and 158 did vote. For placing the fishermen in the reserve, 72. For moving them to the north of Wharf Street, 82. So a margin of 10 votes meant that the development went ahead to the north of Wharf Street. Low-lying land was built up. To give you a sense of how the plebiscite really works and what it means, there is another plebiscite. This was in 1895. The issue then was that there were 7 victuallers, 7 places where you could go and get a drink in Queenscliff. The Act, which tied the number of licences to the population, meant that there should be not quite 4. Here's the votes. For 7, 151 votes. For 6, 2 votes. For 4, 24. The margin, 125 votes. And the 7 pubs continued. The Fisherman's Reserve, what were the conditions? The allotments, which were 20 perches, which is about 1/8 of an old acre, were restricted to bona fide fishermen. If you weren't a bona fide fisherman, you could not get one of these allotments. To be eligible, you had to have a fishing licence, you had to own a boat, and you had to participate in commercial fishing. And this, in the early days, was fairly rigorously enforced. Still identifiable today are 72 allotments with dwellings, not all of them original. Leasehold updates range from 1863, when the scheme started, there were people resident before that, to 1929, when the last allotments were released. Many of the properties were under lease for 80 to 100 years, so a significant period of time. Freehold ranged from 1958 to 1979. Here's an extract from the Government Gazette, 1882. And the bottom 2 names, Ernest Todd, Fisherman's Site, 20 perches. He didn't have 20 perches, the railways had nicked 8, he had 12. He still had to pay his £1 a year. And below him, his brother, Walter Todd, 20 perches on Beach Street, £1. Another aerial view. The Fisherman's Flat precinct is outlined in red. The study that we've undertaken has 4 dimensions. Geography, that's the geography of the flats. Time, the leasehold period. So we restricted ourselves to the leasehold period up to the first freehold. People, the fishermen, but we very quickly realised we were not writing a story and recording a story of fishermen. It was about their families, and particularly the women. The context was Queenscliff and the sea. They may have lived there, but they didn't work there. There was fishing. They manned the pilot boats. They manned the lifeboat. They were part of the military at the fort, and particularly moving people around to the various forts by boat, and the militia, particularly on Swan Island. Mail delivery for Western Victoria. There was a contract to meet the incoming ships and take off the mail that was bound for Western Victoria and landed in Queenscliff, where it then went by train. Quarantine and health, guest houses. There were important individuals, businesses and authorities, and we'll visit some of these as we go forward. We now come to the Todd family. The pyrotechnogram on the site builds. The generations are colour-coded, so the first generation is red. That's the patriarch and matriarch in the sense of who first came to the flats. Not necessarily important in the overall family, but who first came to the flats. Second generation is blue, third is magenta, and so forth. The arrows indicate how they moved around the flats. Here, if you like, are our characters for this presentation. So at the top, Richard Todd and his wife, Harriet Harwood, both born in London, but married in Victoria. 9 children, 5 of them at Queenscliff. Second generation in blue, Harriet, Ernest, Walter and Sydney. And we'll spend most of our time with those individuals. In the third generation, Sarah, Adeline, Hector, Sydney, George, Thelma and Lucy. We have only listed those who have some presence in the flats. If someone went off to Timbuktu and never came back, we haven't followed up what's happened to them, though it may be quite fascinating. So here's the patriarch and matriarch, and they go to 20 Wharf Street. Harriet Emma was at 20 Wharf Street. Here's Ernest, Walter, Sydney, Sarah, Adeline, Hector, Sydney, George, Thelma and Lucy. I don't expect you to read the little boxes, but just look at how the family moved around on the flats. Some of the families we've studied have got 30 members, and you can imagine the tangled pattern that results when you look at how they moved around and where they were resident in the flats. The patriarch and matriarch, Richard and Harriet, were actually born within a couple of kilometres of each other, near the docks by the River Thames in London, not far from the Tower. Richard migrated to Australia as a 3-year-old, as a tiny tot. He grew up around the rocks in Sydney. He became a mariner and at times worked in the coastal trade between Sydney and Melbourne. Harriet made an assisted passage on the ship Statesman, arriving in Melbourne in 1853. She was 21 years old and was indentured to a Mrs. Champlin of Prahran for 30 shillings per month. Harriet and Richard, they married in Melbourne in 1854. They then spent 3 years in the goldfields, so we know what drove Richard to come to Victoria. They did no good. Giving up on gold, he began fishing, first based in Sandringham, but very soon after, in 1862, he came to Fisherman's Flat with Harriet and 3 young children. In 1863, he was one of the 185 residents who signed that petition to establish the municipality of Queenscliff. And there's a reproduction of his signature there in the left-hand panel. He was living in a one-roomed hut with his family, a one-roomed hut. It was named Aloha. We were starting to think, oh, exotic stuff, Hawaii, what's Aloha about? Aloha is actually a town in Scotland. It's famous for its brewery and for its distilling of whiskey. In 1879, as we've already alluded to, the railways meant that Richard lost direct access to Swan Bay. He could no longer walk out his backyard and get to Swan Bay. And he also lost 8 perches of his land. Here's the pedigree of that property, which is 20 Wharf Street. With our modern terminology, there were no numbers back then. or allotment 14 of section 1A. In the 1870s, Richard Todd, remember his occupancy preceded the availability of the leases. And then in 1880s, after Richard had died, his son, Ernest Lansdowne Todd, took over, demolished the shack, and built a house. Richard was in decline for a long time. Harriet, who was important in his life, died of cancer in 1878. In 1879, he was bitten by a snake while rabbiting on Swan Island. It took 3 hours for him to get back and get help. Those two events seem to mark the decline that began in Richard's situation. He made a habit of taking his son's money when he could get his hands on it, and at least one of them left home because of this. In 1881, he was prosecuted for unpaid goods, for bad debts. In 1883, he was fined for neglecting to send Sydney, who we'll come to later, for sending him to school. By 1884, Richard was well behind in his rates, and the Borough Council described his house as a disgraceful hovel, a shanty, which should be done away with. The council suggested that his house should be pulled down. The Sentinel newspaper, which was a local rag then, agreed it would be a disgrace to the lowest locality in a Chinese camp. This tells us two things. The house was pretty shabby, but it also reflects attitudes of the time to the Chinese. An eyesore. Richard died in Geelong Hospital on the 10th of August 1886. His death was reported in Queenscliff of that of a well-known identity, so he was well known in the borough. Emma Todd, his daughter. This language may shock you, but it's the language of the day. Should we sugarcoat it? Should we whitewash it? Should we pretend it didn't happen? I think we should read the words and understand what they mean. An idiot girl named Emma Todd, found wandering about in a disgraceful condition, was brought up as a lunatic. And a certificate having been obtained from the doctors, she was committed to the lunatic asylum at Kew. She was born at Milkmaid's Flat in Bendigo in 1855 and named Harriet Emma, but known as Emma. She was intellectually handicapped, but not so badly so that she was unable to work. She worked as a servant uptown for the great and good. When she bore a child out of wedlock in 1873 at the age of 18, both her parents were charged with abusive and insulting language against a William Patterson, who was thought to be the father. The claim was adjourned for a fortnight, during which time the baby unfortunately died. A request for the cost of the medical attendance for the birth was declined. Patterson denied paternity. For Emma, life did not improve. She was not particularly well liked by her father, who assaulted her in 1876, and he spent 2 days in prison. Here's the actual record. Queenscliff Petty Sessions, 10th of June 1873. The left-hand column is the complainant, the next column along is the defendant. So William Patterson, Richard Todd. Abusive language in a public place, fine 10 shillings. William Patterson against Harriet Todd, same charge, dismissed. And finally, Emma Todd against William Patterson, maintenance of an illegitimate child, adjourned. It came to nothing. She was confined for life. And this one page, which I've split into 2 parts, comprises the entire documentation that exists at Kew concerning her. Diagnosis of dementia brought in by the police from Queenscliff, 21 years old, single, a servant, Protestant. Her father's name at the bottom, Richard Todd, Queenscliff, and then a small note, in good health, pregnant. She spent the remainder of her life in Kew, described as a quiet girl, weak in her mind. She spent 31 years there working on the ward, and she died in 1908. Her second son was born in the lunatic asylum, and at 8 days old, Alfred Christian Todd was sentenced to 15 years in an industrial school. This was a place where you sent mentally impaired children. He was sent there for being a neglected child. He in fact stayed there for 21 years. The extended term and method of release suggests he too was mentally handicapped. And here again is some rather difficult language to cope with. In the Kew Court on Wednesday, a male child born on the 3rd in the Metropolitan Lunatic Asylum was brought before the bench as a neglected child. The mother, a young woman named Emma Todd, was recently admitted to the asylum having been an idiot from birth. Her father, who's a fisherman, has no means of providing for the child. The latter was sent to the industrial school. Life was tough, and life was particularly tough if you were impaired in any way. Ernest's story. Ernest took over the lease of 20 Wharf Street following the death of his father. His first act was to demolish the hut, such as it was. He married Georgina Stewart Moore, and they had 2 children. Ernest served on the lifeboat service for 42 years, 4 decades and some. An amazing record of service. He was involved in many rescues, and we will visit the rescue of the Gans shortly. He played footy, and I'm not going to talk more about footy and the Todds, but there's an illustrious history there. He won the Queenscliff Regatta. He was in demand as a skipper by competitive boat owners, so this was a way he could supplement his income. There was money passed under the table by keen boat owners who were keen at racing but not particularly good at it, and they hired skippers to run their boats for them. His boats were Harriet, Camellia, Gleam, Huena. The lease of 20 Wharf Street remained in Ernest's name after he died, and this is a common theme on the flats, that when the principal died, as long as you paid your £1 a year, the guys that were running the department, who were all in Melbourne, didn't really care, as long as the money came in. One of the boats that he skippered was Josephine Dooney's. You know where the tobacco store now is in Queenscliff? That was in Dooney's place. Dooney started as a fisherman, but then became a businessman. He ran a hairdresser, tobacconist, and also sold fishing tackle out of that property. He was a keen sportsman, but not really a good participant himself, and he hired Ernest to drive his boat and had some success. This pattern of behaviour, the use of professional sailors, the fishermen, in amateur racing, led to them being banned in the late 1890s because they were just too damn good. Ernest, looting, and this is quite a story. The Hollywood was wrecked on the 11th of February in 1890. The looting, or alleged looting, took part some weeks later on the 2nd of March. 4 Queenscliff fishermen, William Jackson, who lived on Wharf Street, Harry Hoppen, who also lived on Wharf Street, Ernest Todd and George Zula, were brought before the local police court because they'd been caught with whiskey. In the second box in the middle, you'll see the name Thomas Dixon. We'll meet him again Here he was not liked. He was the customs man. He later became the superintendent of the lifeboat. The accused anchored, they moored beside the wreck for some hours and then appeared back in the harbour with 31 cases, not 31 bottles, 31 cases of whisky, which they claimed they found floating about. How many tides had come in and out between the 11th of February and the 2nd of March? If anything was floating, it would have been very dispersed. Nevertheless, their case got traction. We don't know how much whisky ended up with the bench, but the case was dismissed. So there was no looting. This, of course, was an honourable thing amongst the fishermen. Anything that got washed up or wrecked was theirs. The next brother, Walter, known as Cack, he also served on the lifeboats. Walter was born in Queenscliff 1864 and he married Annie Louise Stevens in 1888. Annie was born in the goldfields, Huntley, near Bendigo. Her family moved to Queenscliff. She was living on Swan Island and going to school by boat. She was about 16 years old when she married. They had 12 children, just a small family. Walter had the lease of 34 Beach Street in 1891. He was the first leaseholder of that site and he held it for the remainder of his life. With his cooter boat Wattle, he proved he was also a good sailor. He won the Queenscliff Regatta every year, 1934 to 38 inclusive. Here's the pedigree of 34 Beach Street. Walter Algiers Cack Todd from 1891 to 1950 when he died, and then his widow, and then his daughter Sarah Smith. Sarah's daughter, James Henderson Smith, was for a short time in 1945 the mayor of the Borough of Queenscliff. Here's the house as it was in the 1990s with ubiquitous fibro cement covering its now weatherboard again. Walter was a good man, perhaps because he had this woman as his mother-in-law. Elizabeth was born in Swansea, Wales. Her maiden name was Breen, not Bushes there. Her husband was David Hackland Stevens, not part of the Stevens family on the flats. The extended Stevens family on the flats were from Cornwall. Walter with Wattle. The boat was built for him by Mitch Lacko just across the road and launched from the back of the house there. With Wattle, he won the regattas, as I said, 34 to 38. It's said that in 39 he threw the race. The boat Dawn, owned by his son George Jocker Todd, the football player, allowing him to win to improve the price of the boat because it was for sale. We now come to the wreck of the Gange. And here's a photograph. The Gange stuck fast on the Lonsdale Reef. The bow is up, the stern is down. The gentleman second from the right is George Coleman Robinson, and most of the people scattered about him are his family. He was a property developer here in Lonsdale and did a subdivision in 1886. The Gange was built in what we now would call Croatia, but that was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire then. 152 feet long, a cargo of railway line, cement, sulphur and bolts. She had a long journey from London. 31st of March she set out, reached the Port Phillip Heads at 7 p.m. on the 23rd of July. Sunset that day was 5:27, so it was dark. The following sunrise would not come until 7:31 the next day. The Gange went too close to Point Nepean. The pilot was unable to board her. The pilot's schooner Mavis then burnt blue lights, which was a signal, and showed the way out of trouble. The captain mistook these signals and thought he was meant to follow the pilot schooner in. However, her sails were caught aback. She just shot straight across the heads and parked up on the Lonsdale Reef. That happened just before midnight. The captain, the crew of 17 and the captain's wife were taken off by the lifeboat at dawn. The 20-foot lifeboat, powered only by oars, had stood by from 1 a.m. in terrible conditions. With the change of tide and dawn, they were able to rescue the 19 on board, and this small boat, now with 32 people on board, made its way back. The crew were too tired. They eventually got towed in. Here's a contemporary bit of artwork. It's a print and a wood engraving. It was first published in a journal called the Australasian Sketcher, and the original is in the State Library of Victoria. In the bottom panel is the ship on the rocks with the Mavis in the background. In the top view, the captain's wife is being rescued by the lifeboat, dropping into the arms of two of the crew, William Jurgens and Dan Muchmore. She'd already gone to bed and was in her night clothes and had spent the entire night crouched in the bows of the boat, being swept by waves. She, like the rest of the crew, dropped into the arms of the lifeboat men, and they were all rescued. This is the next day. It's not a very good photograph, but it's what we have. Ernest Todd is the guy on the left, and third from the right is Walter Todd. This is the lifeboat crew. What you may perceive as being rocks in the foreground are their hats. They are in fact praying for their own deliverance and praying for the deliverance of the crew. A lot of you will have seen this particular photograph if you've been to the museum. It's usually headed lifeboat practice, and that's just an absolute nonsense. Look at the clothes. They're very well dressed. They've got their hats on their heads. They are wearing their cork vests. This was a celebration of the rescue. The photo was taken a day or two after the rescue on Swan Bay, and you can see Queenscliff in the background. The picture was taken by a man called George Massingham, who was a professional photographer, and he made money by selling this to various newspapers. The crew are annotated, which is a great advantage. Where were the crew when the alarm went out? The current wreck bell was not there then, it was a different system. Well, most of them were in the flats. Two young men, Matthew Matheson and John Robb. Matthew Matheson was from Norway, Robb was from South Australia, were presumably boarding somewhere, and they didn't leave footprints. Frank Waith was living on Gellibrand Street, and Dixon was somewhere nearby, the superintendent. All the rest lived on the flats. But there are a lot of family connections amongst this crew. Frank Waith, living on Gellibrand, he was the coxswain, so he's the most senior of the crew. And Dan Muchmore Jr., whose photograph I showed you earlier, are half-brothers. Their mother, Elizabeth Carolyn Moritz, Henry Currow and Lewis Currow are in fact her grandchildren, so another set of brothers. So the first two are their uncles. Charles Miller and William Farrell are also half-brothers. Mr. Miller died and the mother remarried to Farrell, so Mary Ann Saunders was their mother. And finally, we have the two Todd brothers. So of the crew, 4 sets of brothers, a family affair. This event was huge. Every newspaper in Australia and some overseas published accounts of what happened. Some of them went for pages, they were huge. The bravery of the lifeboat crew was acknowledged by the captain of the Gange, by the Austro-Hungarian consul and by the Governor of Victoria. The Mayor of Ballarat arranged a tribute dinner. First they met at Craig's Hotel in Ballarat, had a jolly good time, thought it was a good idea. They all came down on the train and arranged a dinner for 120 guests at Adman's Hotel. Both mayors were publicans. The lifeboat crew were rewarded officially £5, the coxswain 6, and the superintendent 8. The Ballarat folks also bought gold sovereigns. Here's the crew, and you can see the names are Croatian names. This was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The only person who wasn't Austrian is Giovanni Gasparini, who was an Italian. Illuminated addresses were a popular thing. They had nothing to do with illumination. There were no candles, there were no lights, but there was a lot of gold leaf. The Ballarat folks had an illuminated address prepared, and these are the words, and I'll just read the first paragraph. The Commodore and members of the Ballarat Yacht Club, together with the whole of the residents of Ballarat and District, wish to offer you their hearty congratulations on the successful rescue of all hands from the Austrian barque Gange, when stranded at Point Lonsdale on the night of the 23rd of July, 1887. This document hung in the town hall for a long time, then in Queenscliff Free Library. It's now in the Maritime Museum in their collection. Sydney Todd. And Sydney's the gentleman with the fish standing near the mast on the Cuda boat. He lived first at 36 Beach Street and then moved across the road to number 19. Sydney's mother died when he was just 10. His father was on a bit of a downward spiral as well. It's not surprising that Sydney might have been a little delinquent. At the age of 16, he was before the Queenscliff Police Court for insulting behaviour, and within 2 days, annoying an inoffensive Chinaman on Swan Island. None of you would have done this. On the night in question, a number of boys congregated in the vicinity of a hut and with more than military ardour poured on the roof a continuous shower of stones. We used to knock on the front door and leave a lighted cracker and run like hell. The Chinaman ran out of the tenement, recognised amongst others the defendants that were before the court. They were given a severe reprimand, a substantial fine for young men, 10 shillings each and 7 and 6 in costs. Mr. Heron told them if they did it again and got caught, 3 months in jail. He wasn't finished, however, and he must have had a thing about Chinese men. In 1875, he was taken into custody accused of having stolen a sail valued at £1 10 shillings, which he hid in a culvert, and he'd stole it from a Chinese fisherman. There was evidence from 2 other Chinese men via an interpreter, which just confused everyone. Henry Hoppin, a fisherman and friend of Sydney's, claimed the sail had been in fact stolen from him in the first place. Sydney was given the benefit of the doubt and the case was dismissed. Perhaps part of that is that the court thought he was 14. He was in fact in his 17th year. Troublemaking wasn't quite over for him. In 1890, now old enough to have a drink, he was fined for insulting conduct in the Shades Bar of the Royal Hotel one Saturday night. Before settling down, and we'll hear this story shortly, Sydney set out to see the world. He then married Florence Elizabeth Breen in 1903 and they had 9 children. He obtained the lease of 36 Beach Street in 1913 and held that for 17 years. It is likely that other family members were living in it for much of that time. He obtained the lease of 19 Beach Street in 1927. He was the fish packer. Doesn't sound like much. Get the fish, put them in a box. What else is there to do? He was in charge of the wharf, of keeping it tidy. He was in charge of taking the fish to meet the train. He was in charge of the accounting, the sale of the fish and the money. And he and his wife were responsible for the distribution of the money. She had in the house a large square of canvas with multiple little pockets sewn into it. Each of those pockets was for a particular fishing boat. And when the money came in, divided by the number of boxes of fish, worked out a price per box, multiplied by the number of boxes the individual boat had, that's how much money was put in those envelopes, in those little compartments, so that the families could collect their earnings. Here's Florence in front of number 19 with a couple of her grandchildren. Sydney also served on the lifeboat. 19 years he accrued. Those three brothers accrued 96 years of service on the lifeboat. Not to be outdone, Hector in the next generation individually accrued 50 years on the lifeboat. An enormous tradition of service to the community. Now Sydney is seen here on the right, he's on the extreme right, with friends. He's outside the sidebar of the Queenscliff Hotel. That wasn't his normal place where he had a drink. And I have here, courtesy of Ron Hodgetts, Sydney's pot. Sydney frequented the Esplanade Hotel, which was acknowledged to be the Fisherman's Hotel. If you were a frequent and consistent attender, you were given your own glass, which was kept on a shelf above the bar for your exclusive use. And this is Sydney's drinking vessel from all that time ago. And it's pieces of ephemera like this that add substance to the stories about these people. The Todd family nearly escaped the common problem for fishermen of drowning. Lucy Todd, daughter of Richard and Florence, married Edward Ted Ryan. He became a fisherman. He obtained the lease of 19 Beach Street in 1952 after the death of his mother-in-law, Florence Todd. Lived there with his wife, Lucy Ann. Ted and Bill Withers were drowned in 1954. It's the Robert John salvaging timber from the time. It's a case of no good turn goes unpunished. They were rushing back because Ted Ryan was in the band, in the town band. He was due to perform in front of another Governor-General, Sir William Slim. So they rushed their return, got hit with a big squall of wind. Boat was actually observed to turn turtle and then disappear, and wreckage was found on the shore. We now come to lords and ladies. I said at the outset that the fishermen knew that they were held in low regard by the community. They did not reciprocate that. They treated everyone alike, regardless of their status. So this is Lord Thomas Brassey and Lady Sybil de Vere Brassey, his second wife. Thomas was the final governor of colonial Victoria. He both took up and left the post in his own steam-assisted three-masted topsail yard schooner, as one does. He was a qualified ship's captain. He skippered the Sunbeam and was still sailing her at 80 years of age. Lady Brassey was a competent navigator. So that's Thomas on the left, the family shield, centre left, Thomas and Sybil at the Melbourne Cup in 1896. She was allegedly a suffragette. She advised women to throw away their corsets and to ride bicycles. I think she might be wearing a corset, however, in this particular photograph. She has a very tiny waist, and that's her on the right. The arrival of the new governor was heavily orchestrated. He was to arrive in Melbourne in the afternoon on the 25th of October. In order to get the timing right, the Sunbeam arrived the day before, came through the heads with the pilots, and then parked up overnight to leave the next morning to be in Melbourne at the appointed time. The Brassies were not going to come ashore. The first foot on land would be in Melbourne. As they came through the heads, there was a 17-gun salute. Not quite as many as the 21 that the Austrian Emperor-elect got. Salutes are between 3 and 21 guns, and it depends where you are in the hierarchy how many shots you get. But there's no 7-gun salute. The Sunbeam answered the salute with some gunfire of its own. The pilots, some of whom the crew of the pilot boat, of course, were fishermen, organised a 40-cooter boat escort, sailing in 2 parallel lines beside the new governor and his ship. When she was parked up, they then circled the ship 3 times. There was a crowd and bunting on Shortlands Bluff. The fishermen's children gazumped all of the officials. In the welcome, Lillian Tobin, Reuben's daughter, presented flowers. How did this come about? The fishermen had very good intelligence. A man called Charles Peterson was the publican at the Espy. The fishermen therefore knew that Lady Brassey's daughter was hiding out in the Espy to be picked up as her parents came through the heads. They also knew, because John Muchmore was in the crew of the Mars, the steamship here, or the steam launch, that Lady Brassey was going to come over on the Mars to pick up her daughter, to take her back to join the family before they went up to Melbourne. So the fishermen, through the daughter, presented flowers to the young lady before she stepped on the Mars. And that was the first presentation of any sort to the arriving governor. Amazing impact of this flotilla of cooter boats, and more realistic view of cooter boats on the right. Brassey took off his hat and put it under his arm, and with his wife standing beside him, saluted every single boat as they sailed around. This, in naval terms and in yachting terms, is the highest accolade you can give for anyone. Lady Brassey said, "What a great display. They did this in all a gale of wind." She thought it was excellent seamanship. Not only did they achieve this accolade of the salute, but they also managed to drop off a basket of fresh fish. George Baillieu, the upstart mayor and at that time publican of the Ozone, got a ride across and presented to the governor an illustrated address made by the same man that made the one for the Gange rescue. Baillieu was instructed to tell the fishermen that Brassey would come to the next Queenscliff regatta and that he would provide prizes for it. In the contemporary press, a lot of attention was paid to the fact that George Baillieu was born in the colony, that he was a native Australian. Well, only a few weeks after the arrival, Queenscliff Regatta, beginning of January 1896, Brassey came. He was late, but he came. There was a Lady Brassey Cup and a Lord Brassey Cup. The second race in the event was won by a boat called Eiffel Tower. And the skipper, not the owner, but the skipper was a man called William Pomeroy Jones, a native of the Flats. He was later part of the crew on the Sunbeam when they returned to England. After the race, there was an A&A concert, and the Brasseys hadn't been in office long, but it was time to go on holidays. They went to Tasmania for a bicycle holiday, as one does when you have your own boat. But on the 29th of October, Queen Victoria, who you met at the beginning, issued letters patent establishing the office of Governor-General for Australia, for the new Australia, and issued instructions to Lord Hopetoun to become the first governor. Hopetoun had been the governor before Brassey. He had the advantage that he was back in England and could lobby much more effectively. Brassey cut short his appointment for personal reasons. He took his bat and ball and went home. The Sunbeam had been mothballed for years. It was recommissioned and a civilian crew was recruited, mostly from Williamstown, but 3 Queenscliff fishermen joined the crew. They were Alfred Salvador Currow, William Pomeroy Jones and Sydney Richard Todd, all from the Flats. Humble men from the Flats mixing with the lords and ladies. Brassey's last act before leaving, in fact on the same day, was to lead and farewell the 2nd Victorian contingent on its way to the Boer War. He led the parade in an open coach and then set sail in the Sunbeam for England. Here's a photograph courtesy of Trudy Scott, and we can definitely identify the gentleman who's arrowed. That is her grandfather, Alfred Currow of Queenscliff, a fisherman. Quite a good crew. 2 officers, 3 stewards, 2 cooks, 3 stokers and 14 seamen, 3 of them from Queenscliff. Another photo, and again holding the life ring, is Alfred Currow, and some of the faces around him are similar to the faces that are around him and may represent the Victorian crew. When they left, there was to be a 17-gun salute for the departing governor. All the important people were up in Melbourne to farewell the Boer War guys and to farewell the governor. They made a mistake. They fired the 17-gun salute, but for the wrong boat. A good half hour later, when they realised their mistake and realised that the Sunbeam was upon them, they did not have the means to reload and fire a second salute. So a bit of a fizz at the end. Here's the voyage. Personal reasons, needs to get home in a hurry. Well, it took 5.5 months. He was going to go up the Suez Canal, but then he heard his son was in South Africa for the Boer War, so they diverted. A long voyage, 18,511 nautical miles, roughly half under sail and half under steam. He published a journal, again derived from the ship's log, and we can see in the left-hand column A. Currow, and we can also see that William Jones is no longer a seaman, he's an assistant steward. So he must have been a bit of a silver-tongued sort of guy to work his way up in the world. Brassey was effusive in his journal in praise for the crew. In an experience of 40 years, they were the best crew I've ever had. Good men aloft, sturdy pullers on deck, clever with the palm and needle, fixing sails, careful at the wheel, respectable and sober on shore, intelligent, well instructed, well mannered, in short, nature's own gentleman. A bit of a contrast to the views expressed by the Queenscliff Borough Council in early days. In matters outside their proper calling, they came out particularly well. All could join a chorus. On this journey, every Thursday, they had a concert that they organised themselves. All could discuss politics. So the fisherman and the Lord mixed socially quite a bit. For the three men from Fisherman's Flat, sailing with Lord Brassey would have been the experience of a lifetime. We've come to the end. The lifeboatmen going home. Thank you for your attention.